Just 1 minute.
Sure. Okay, got it. Okay, perfectly fine. So, in fact, the last class we were talking about the Armenian and the Chinese diaspora, and how the colonization or the colonial, how they were affected by the colonizations or the colonial powers. This time we look at, a set of diasporas which we term as refugees diasporas, and they are right across our neighbors. So without much ado, let me stop my video and share my presentation. Just a sec. Here we are. Okay. Can you see the presentation?
I can see.
Okay. Can the rest of the participants see the presentation?
Yes, sir.
Okay, perfectly fine. Again, as a matter of protocol or process, as soon as you suddenly feel there is the voice going, or you can't see the presentation, or the slides are not moving, just either send it in a chat or stop me, because sometimes the internet slows down for various reasons. And at that moment, I really, and a very interesting thing which happens is that, today when we do this whole lot of discourse on digital, and then suddenly, the technology is not available, and you wonder how things are happening. For example, Manipur, almost 2 months, the internet is not available. So that also goes along. So today we are talking about Tibetan, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi, and Afghanis diaspora. I would also want, as we are going along, if you can open up a separate window on Google and see how did Tibetan, what is the Tibetan history? How did the nation come about? For example, Sri Lanka was Ceylon earlier. It was 48 that Ceylon got independent. It was only in 72 when the name changed. How did Bangladesh? Most of us in normatively know how Bangladesh was created. It was much later in the 70s. What is the history of Afghanistan? A little bit about of history does get you some context into what you are talking about. And again, as I said, and I think I will keep repeating this, the story of human being is the story of movement, the story of migration. And again, when we look at history and we look at various things, remember, history is divergent. It is a point of view from, you can read history from various points of view. And as academics and scholars, when we look at theory, we typically step back a couple of steps and then try and understand how things are or why things are the way they are. If we do not, and very important for scholars and academicians, or when you're reading theory, to step back, because if you do not, then inevitably one as a student is not able, or as a scholar or an academician is not able to understand and gets involved in the immediate. So so let's see how this works about. Let's look at the objectives. Understanding socioeconomic profile of refugee communities. All these diasporas are typically refugee diasporas or refugee communities living in India. Livelihood and other issue challenges faced by them. We are going to look at a little bit about how rehabilitation becomes a contentious issue with divergent viewpoints. First and foremost, let's understand a lot of people tend to use refugee, exile, migrant interchangeably. They have been used interchangeably, though they derive different meanings in academic usage. So let's try and clear this up. Again, as I said, Dr. Sadanand has all the presentation, but if you write to me, for example, Kangan has sent an email to me, and I sent the presentations to him. So if you send an email to me, I can send you all the presentations, or you can take it from Dr. Sahu. Refugees are persons fleeing from armed conflict or persecutions. 19.5 million at the end of 2014. They would be much more, considering the fact that there are many more conflicts which are happening. Migrants, on the other hand, choose to move not because of a direct threat of persecution, but mainly to improve lives. Unlike refugees, they who cannot safely return home. Migrants face no some impediments. So migration is more back and forth movement. It's more voluntary than refugees. And the third category being that of exile. Definition being a state of being banished from one's home or country, that could be voluntarily being banished or forcefully being banished, forced to live away from one's country. It could be voluntarily also, especially as a punishment. So that clears up a little bit about refugees, exiles, and migrants. Uh, Refugees and a lot of times exiles do not have a choice, whereas migrants have a choice. Again, as a background, India is neither a party to the 1951 Convention on Refugees nor the 1967 Protocol. In fact, it was only in 2006 that a bill came about which talked about refugees but never became an act. In fact, from 2008, as we see later, 2008, there was a committee which was set up to discuss, but didn't lead to anywhere. So in the absence of any specific refugee legislation, Indian government adopts an ad hoc approach. And this ad hoc is based on geopolitical, is based on national politics, and so on and so forth. Mainly by political and administrative decisions rather than by a codified model of conduct. The good part about codified model of conduct is that the state gets bound to do a certain thing. In an ad hoc, then it's dictated by the politics of the day. So, whatever point of view one looks at it, that's the way it works. So ad hoc means all refugees do not get the same treatment based on geopolitical and political considerations. Those entering the country without a visa are treated as illegal immigrants. And that's why a lot of times the news headlines about illegal immigrants. Typically, there is a point of view which says that how can any immigrant be illegal? But, that's how it is defined, that a country entering the country without a visa is treated as an illegal immigrant under the Foreigners Act 46. The Foreigners Act has also been, amended, I think in 2008 or something, or the Indian Passport Act. So under these acts, then a migrant is termed as illegal if the one does not have a visa. So now let's look at each of these communities. Tibetans found in Dharamshala, in Odisha, in Delhi, in Mysore. Various sources put the population of Tibetans around 1.5 lakhs. Again, when was this? How was this calculation done, and so on and so forth. And then there are this migrations back and forth, and there are people who came to India, then migrated to the US, and so on and so forth. Two large waves of Tibetan migration. First wave in 59. This was the time when China took over Tibet. 85,000 refugees followed the Holiness Dalai Lama, the spiritual head. They established a community in the town of Dharamshala. In the 80s, when Tibet got open to trade and tourism, the second wave came in. From 86 to 96, about 25,000 Tibetans joined their exiled community in India. And in fact, today also, a whole lot of Tibetan families send their young ones to India for them to, learn the various cultural constructs of Tibetans and to study in Dharamshala and so on and so forth. For the Tibetans, India as a state granted refugee status and permitted them to set up a government in exile. So in Dharamshala, there's a Central Tibetan Administration, CTA, which has got an autonomy in public education, but India does not officially recognize it as a government, though they are a government in exile. So that's in Dharamshala. So again, Tibetans, like what we saw, Chinese, different occupations, engaged in agriculture in Odisha and in Mysore, whereas in Delhi and other places, they are engaged in garment business. So you see those Tibetan bazaars, travel and tours, retail shops, knives, carpets, drugs, Thangka painting. So what is a Thangka painting? This is a Thangka painting. Tibetan Buddhist painting on cotton, silk, alpaca, usually depicting Buddhist deity scenes or mandalas. So this is one of the cultural construct of the Tibetans. GOI, the Government of India formalized the Tibetan rehabilitation policy in 2014. Uniform policy in all states where Tibetans reside, access to various Indian government schemes and benefits, and also extending central and states benefit, including education, employment, Indira Awas Yojana, Manrega, banking, etc. So think about it, 59, 2014, the policy got formalized. So normally it takes time. There are various things at play when a policy has to be formalized or a policy has to be made. So that was Tibetan. Let's look at the Sri Lankan scenario. In fact, if you just open up Google and look at how Tibet came about, just see, just have a read as to how Tibet got formed, what was the history of Tibet. You will see that there were various people controlling Tibet, and how Tibet got formed, how because of the fact there were a lot of Chinese dynasties which were ruling it at one point of time. Again, as I was telling you, the history of human being, nation states is a very relatively new phenomena. Before the nation states came about, there were various dynasties, various empires which moved about, which had various areas. So Sri Lanka was actually Ceylon. Ceylon got its independence. It was initially a Portuguese colony, which was handed over to the Dutch. From the Dutch, it came to the British. British were ruling it, and Ceylon got its independence in 48. In fact, Ceylon comes from serendipity. If you look at it, the word serendipity comes from that. So serendipity, which was a Persian Arabic word, that's how the Ceylon came about. The Sri Lanka name change from Ceylon in 72, I think. Barely 30 miles off the coast of Tamil Nadu. Strong historic. In fact, there was a kingdom in the south which was ruling Sri Lanka before the Dutch. During the 19th and the 20th century, Tamils from Jaffna migrated and settled in India for various reasons, such as education. Considering the fact that British was a large colonizing power, people were moving around in that spectrum for various reasons. Refugees from Sri Lanka largely arrived in India in three waves: 64, 83, and 2009. In fact, the Sri Lankan problem started with the independence when the Sri Lanka passed what was called the Ceylon, bill on citizenship. And if you see the nation states and the concept of citizenship brought in some new set of issues which were not there before these nation states came about. So 48 and in fact, the Sri Lankan civil war was from 83 to 2009. At one point, Tamil Nadu had about 2 lakhs refugees. Government of Tamil Nadu has given all benefits in terms of welfare schemes to refugees, saying for registered Sri Lankan. In fact, interestingly, there is a lot. There are Sinhalese, diaspora in India too. It's not just Tamil, but Sinhalese also, a very small number of Sinhalese, but nevertheless there. So the government of Tamil Nadu provides all these things. In spite of this, the interesting part happens. I was reading this story in one of the news outlet where in spite of providing all this facility and education till class 12, this girl student wanted to go to the States for higher studies. Now, because she's a refugee, and the fact is she does not, and India is not a signatory to the convention or the protocol. Now, who is going to say that this Sri Lankan girl, Tamil girl, is their citizen or what? What is the status of this girl? So, because she was in India as a refugee, she could not, take up this higher education in the US because the papers were incomplete. So there are these unique things which happen in the absence of all these, issues. And in fact, the Sri Lankan Tamils are also broadly classified as Jaffna Tamils, the Eastern Tamils, the Colombo Tamils, and the Plantation Tamils. So no particular community is uniformly classified. We have seen that in the Indian NRI community. We have seen the Indians in the US, Indians in Europe, Indians otherwise, and similarly is with all communities. Last and bottom of the pile being the plantation Tamils or the Indian Tamils, whose forefathers were Tamils brought from Tamil Nadu by the Britishers to work in the plantations. So again, there's a hierarchy in spite of the fact that they come from a common stock. The plantation Tamils were forced into India because of the Ceylon Citizenship Act of 42 was the starting of the Sri Lankan problem. Because according to the 48 Act, citizenship in independent Ceylon, a person born after 48 can only be a citizen if the person's father already a citizen of Ceylon. Now, inevitably, because of various migrations, because of colonization, because of various movements, and especially for Sri Lankan Tamils, that became an issue, which is what subsequently led to a civil war and so on and so forth. So as I was telling you, colonization had its own set of problems in terms of migration and diaspora formation of nation states, and the bringing of the citizenship acts by various nations created its own set of issues, because there was a whole lot of migration, people moving about. In fact, that's now in today's time, with people moving about in terms of jobs, with digital diasporas coming in, and you see all kinds of counter movements happening. So this was a news item again, as I picked up, feature story on Sri Lankan refugees. Indian government provided them with Aadhaar cards, who have spent 182 days. Now, again, if you look at this story vis-a-vis the Aadhaar cards which have been given to Indian citizens, and Aadhaar was brought in as an identity. Initially, Aadhaar as a concept was proposed in border states. Look at the fact that how this particular thing itself has evolved. So we have been given Aadhaar cards like other Indian citizens, but our status as refugees is mentioned. So now, does this Aadhaar card enable a refugee to open a bank account, create a passport? Does he or she becomes an Indian citizen? How does this work out? And obviously, you can see this is bound to create other issues. So when we talk about rehabilitation of refugees vis-a-vis citizens, how does it work out? How does the state treat them? Is security the larger lens through which the state looks at refugees? There are so many issues which come about. So as we go around, we'll see more about rehabilitation. India is engaged in now. What India is also doing is implementation of multiple development assistance projects in Sri Lanka. Supported efforts to now. India is supporting efforts to preserve Sri Lankan's character as a multi-ethnic, multilingual, and multi-religious society, and helping Sri Lanka. Essentially, objective being that once those projects come in and Sri Lanka recognizes or creates a conducive environment, then all these refugees can go back. The problem then happens is that once people migrate, settle in a host country, get incorporated in their culture, there is a certain amount of integration, then the home country looks alien. So it's kind of a negotiation. There are multiple efforts which go into this. And then we look at there's a lot of talk on the Bangladeshi migrant community. We have a lot of news which gets generated on the Bangladeshis. It's a predominant refugee community in India. In fact, the setting up of Bangladesh, India had a major role to play. Census 2001 estimated number of Bangladeshi migrants in India were 3.1 million. Bangladesh has a contiguous border with India, with a lot of states. So during Bangladesh Liberation War 71, the Indo-Bangladesh, in fact, one of the reasons, as they say, that why the war came about was the fact there was this genocide happening in Bangladesh. Bangladesh initially was East Pakistan when the partition happened. But however, that also becomes an interesting thing. When partition happened, Punjab was split up into West Punjab and East Punjab. And Bengal was split into East Bengal and West Bengal. And East Bengal was East Pakistan. And culturally, the Bengals were identical. Culturally, the both Punjabs were identical. To Bengalis to move there and find safe shelter in India, the state governments of West Bengal, Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura had established refugee camps. In 71, and million Bangladeshis. In fact, it was a very difficult time from India because so many refugees suddenly descended on India. India needed help internationally because to take care of so many refugees was a very difficult task. And then subsequently a war happened. In fact, I came across this book on the Bangladeshi migrants in India, and the tagline is foreigners, refugees, or infiltrators. It's an Oxford publication by Rizwana Shamshad. And in fact, in this book, Rizwan is talking about post-71. 71 migrants from Bangladesh in India can be divided into two main groups: the Hindu Bangladeshis, the Muslim Bangladeshis. Persecution, economic needs. And in Muslim Bangladeshis, there are three categories: one who have settled in Muslim majority areas, daily laborers, and those who settled in Kolkata, Delhi, and other Indian cities. So in the absence of policy, what typically happens is then, ad hocism typically is not able to answer a lot of complicated questions. a policy is much suited. That is why governments or states formulate policies. However, we have somehow not been able to get one. So Rizwan is talking about how these is categorized. Then these leads. Uh, just a sec, guys. Sorry. So, and these lead to other consequences. For example, the Assam movement was a consequence of a lot of Bangladeshi migrants coming out there anxious about losing identity. And remember, we talked about in whole diaspora studies, we would talk about identity being a core issue. Then there are identity politics. Then there is, a citizen versus migrant. Assam's nationalist party, the Assam Gana Parishad, and the main separatist group, the Alpha, were the two major outcomes of this movement. And these, so when we look at, for example, Northeast, and today, if we read about Manipur, there are, we need to understand that borders are, on a map, we could see a line, but when we go in the real world, borders are, much different. You cannot draw a line. People move about. How do you treat those people? And then, for example, today Myanmar is in a political, upturn. Then, communities have over history, communities have formed. How do communities react with each other? How do they negotiate? So there are many issues which come about. So this was a news item in 16 December 2020, which says more illegal Bangladeshi migrants leaving India than entering since 2017. In fact, the interesting part is today, the GDP growth of Bangladesh happens to be higher than the India's GDP growth. It's a very interesting thing which is happening. So past 4 years, nearly twice the number of illegal, and mind you, the word illegal Bangladeshi migrants obviously come in because India is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention, and they use it in terms of the Foreigners Act. So they use the term illegal by Bangladeshi migrants for caught leaving the country than those coming in illegally. So this is a news item. So let's move from the east to the west. Afghanistan, again, if you look at the Afghanistan as a nation, Afghanistan as a modern nation typically was attributed to Dost Muhammad. There were the Durrani Empire which came in before. So if you just Google, you will see the history of Afghanistan, how things have moved. Thousands of people from Afghanistan migrated in the last few years, mostly settled in New Delhi and Hyderabad. Estimated number of Afghani refugees are about 10,000. Most of the recent refugees are Hindus and Sikh refugees, because Afghanistan is also in tumult with, and Afghanistan has been a theater of tumult since a very long time. An estimated 60,000 Afghanis fled to India after the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 79. Subsequently, thousands came when the Taliban took power in 92. Then the 9/11 happened. The Taliban were driven out. Taliban are back. In 2007, about 9,200 refugees were living in India. So there are again multiple sources as to how many Afghani refugees are there. More recently, Indian government has agreed to naturalize many of these Hindu and Sikh Afghans who have lived in India since 79. The Indian government has issued to most Afghani refugees with valid residence permits, affords them a degree of legal protection. Attaining residence permit has been more difficult for new arrivals. There, newer arrivals that arrived between 2004 and 2007. So obviously, because Afghanistan is in tumult, people are moving. Then there are people who come to India and then move out to other nations. So that's the way the Afghani refugees are there. You will find a lot of Afghani refugees in Delhi. In fact, Lajpat Nagar has a lot of them staying out there. So now one has to look at the socio-economic conditions. So, typically, how does a nation work with refugees? Do they, typically say no to refugees? Humanitarian wise, inevitably, if there is a conflict or if there's persecution in the neighborhood, people would travel. And again, as I said, borders are not like lines; they are contiguous spaces by which people can come in. And one of the issue of socio-economic survival becomes significant in a host country. The Sri Lankan refugees, for example, generally resided in refugee camps scattered across the state. Then the issue happens: how do you handle refugee camps? How does resources get allocated? Besides resources, what do you do with the people? Do they get education? Do they get employment? What is the policy in terms of how do you engage them? Work as unskilled labor in informal sector to supplement their incomes. Basic Medicare, do you provide them Medicare? You do not provide. So then there are a lot of human right issues which come in. There are other economic issues which come in. There are these immigrants versus citizen issues which come in. How do you work with them? Who provides the food? Despite these provisions, conditions in the camp are generally poor, with insufficient health and sanitary facilities available for refugee population. We need to understand India itself is a huge country, has got a huge population. Always resources are limited, and that's why because resources being limited, the citizen versus immigrant conflict then heightens up. Then identity politics comes into the picture, and so on and so forth. So, for example, this is from a New India Express. This picture has been taken in 2019. This is before COVID. This is a Sri Lankan refugee colony in Tamil Nadu. So, if you look at a quick glance of the picture, there is a thing which becomes very apparent, that the water facility is not there. So you will see somebody ferrying water cans. There are water jerry cans outside. There is a big tanker out there. There are open drains. There definitely seems to be a makeshift toilets which are made out there. So obviously, with human beings, with human settlements, water and sanitation becomes an issue. Medicines, education. There is this child with some, with books or notebooks walking. So obviously, some education must be happening. And that's why states and governments try and encourage voluntary repatriation of refugees. But in case where the home country continues to be in tumult, where the conditions are not, for example, today, even if India wants Afghani refugees to be repatriated, the conditions in Afghanistan are just not there for repatriation. Government of India has emphasized that that a conducive environment should be created for Sri Lankan refugees. Extended, and now you've seen Sri Lanka going into another economic, tumult. So and subsequently, then it so happens that when you migrate, you settle down in a particular area, you start integrating with the local culture, and then going back is again a second migration. A lot of people resist that, so that becomes an issue. With Bangladeshis, according to Ministry of Home Affairs, significant number of Bangladeshis migrate through illegal process. December 2001, estimated 12 million illegal migrants resided in India. Generally find work in informal sector on cheap wages, work as domestic helper, construction labor. Inevitably, we need to understand people do move based on economics. Besides persecution, a lot of movement of people. So, for example, Indians are traveling abroad. There was a recent news item about these Gujarati migrants who were, illegally crossing into the US. The Gujarati family who, got stuck in the snow and died. So obviously, people migrate looking at better socio-economic position. The government official sources reveal that they hide their original identity, which is normally how people work, hide original identity, change names, and stay in a host country for earning money. Economic becomes a very important criteria for migration. Similarly, because a majority of Afghan community holds residence permits, many Afghans are able to find work in the informal sector, running shops, working as salespeople. There are obviously some prosperous Afghan refugees. A large number of them live in poverty, shared crime, and inevitably then it becomes a cyclic process. You are marginalized, then you become further marginalized. Poverty goes hand in hand with marginalization. Receive some support from their community and from various welfare societies like Khalsa Diwan Society and Gurdwaras. This would be typically the Sikh community, and we tend to forget that there is a minority Sikh community in Afghanistan, a minority Sikh community in Pakistan. So that's about Afghans coming to India. Refugees are socially most vulnerable, which is always the case because anytime you migrate, you are socially most vulnerable, treated as outsiders, as far as their social identity is concerned, face many socio-cultural and economic problems. For example, forget about refugees coming from outside. We've heard about so many cases about Northeast, people from Northeast, face treated as outsiders a lot of times in Delhi. Because again, there is a certain amount of identity we are not able to understand. There are multiple identities, there are multiple cultures, and in fact, lack of refugee status, lack of housing facilities, education, formal employment, identities issues, and that typically is happening because of a lack of policy. They remain socially, economically backward, resulting in poverty. And then it becomes a cyclic process. So you are economically backward, there is poverty, leads to marginalization. Once it leads to marginalization, you are not able to get out economically, you are not able to contribute as you can. And this typically refugees face a lot. And then there is no regulatory framework for protection of refugees and exiled communities in India. And that is again because of a lack of act. The government has not enacted any laws or regulation relating to the status of asylum seekers. Those persons are governed by the Foreigners Act of 46. Again, as I keep telling you, we have not to look at all these things as right or wrong or good or bad. This is just how it is. And there are many issues which come about in terms of making a policy or making a regulatory framework. So, for example, the South Asian Human Rights Documentation Centers, although the Extradition Act of 62 provides some protection, so there is an Extradition Act to refugees facing extradition. This does not provide real safeguards for the majority of refugees in India, and there are refugees whose removal falls into the category of expulsion rather than extradition. So do we look at refugees from the human rights angle? Do we look at it from the citizen angle? Do we look at it from a security lens? And more often than not, it's not just India. When we look at the world, a large part of the world has started looking at migrants from the security lens. Only specific refugees groups like Tibetans and Sri Lankans are recognized and supported directly, in which also there are, what happens when they want to go out. Other refugees, such as those from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Somalia, have to obtain a refugee status. Now, refugee status is determined from UNHCR, United Nations High Commission on Refugees. For this purpose, they must travel to the UNHCR office in New Delhi, assesses that they fall under the definition of refugees. So there's a UN body which looks at refugees. And then there is this cross-cultural interaction. The refugees tend to lose identity in the long run. And again, it depends on how big the size of the refugee groups is, attitude of host society to refugee community. If the process of acculturation is slow, the result is isolation. For example, the Sri Lankan community, it's a large society. The host, the state of Tamil Nadu is much more, amenable to the refugee issue. So there is a slightly little better than maybe the other. For example, again, Tibetan, Himachal, Dharamshala, there is much more amenability. Then, of course, there is a policy in place. And then, of course, there are the challenges of rehabilitation. So the Refugees and Asylum Seeker Protection Bill 2006 never got into an act. Since 2008, the Refugee Bill has been consideration by an interministerial committee, including NHRC. In fact, I was reading this bill, 2006 bill. It had all the necessary, human right things like a refugee is entitled to education, to water and sanitation, to respect and to certain opportunities, a certain amount of legal safeguards. In the absence of any of the four of the Act, key thematic areas being access to adequate housing, access to education, support to peace building, and support to self-reliance and sustainable reintegration through regional initiatives. Now, in the absence of this, what happens to those refugees? Because inevitably the refugees have to live somewhere. They have to, if you don't provide them access to education, that what do the children do? How do the children come and work in the society? Inevitably, then there is crime because there are no economic opportunities. Again, a security lens comes into the picture. So rehabilitation becomes, in the absence of a policy or a bill or of a legal thing, it becomes more difficult to negotiate. Refugees are typically looked at from a security, and it's not about India. We see this from across the world. Nation states are looking at refugees from a security lens. We just heard about how Britain was looking at sending the refugees to Rwanda, which just got defeated in the House of Lords. So all nations, and think about the fact that Britain, for all the mess as a word, if we use, which happened during colonization, where there was a large population which was indentured, moved about, is now grappling with the refugee issue. UNHCR 2011 observed that when refugees have access to land, labor markets, livelihood opportunity, enjoy freedom of movement, they can have positive economic impact by creating jobs, service facilities, or contributing to agriculture production and local economy. Now that's where the nation, the identity politics and the politics of citizen versus refugee comes in. How does it work about? So, for example, as we looked at the Assam agitation, where the Assamese started getting threatened with the influx of Bangladeshi refugees into Assam, they started getting, they felt they were being swamped by the refugees who will take over their lands and their jobs. Then there are other considerations which come into picture. So, yes, we are very much on time. Let's sum up. With inclusive economic and educational policies, some refugee communities are gradually integrated to local economy, as in the case of Tibetan refugees. However, all refugee communities are not same level of integration culturally, socially, and economically. These are some references in suggested reading. There is a Bernstoff on the Tibet. There's a lot of work on the Tibetan diaspora. I saw Preeti Chahal, Refugee Inflows in South Asia, a case study of Sri Lankan refugees in India. This is a thesis. Then, of course, there is Maina Sharma, Refugees in Delhi, working paper, Center for Civil Society. Then there's UNHCR, State of World Refugees 99. There are, when you get your course material, there are a whole lot of other references and suggested readings. You can go through that. And if you look at the media reports also, media reports also give a lot of information on that. So let me stop sharing. And if there are any questions. I think I broadly covered these four refugee communities. And as I said, if you just Google a little bit about the history of these countries, how these countries came about, a sense of understanding as how things unfolded and how these communities became refugees, and how they came to India, and what are the consequences of them coming to India, and what are the consequences which are unfolding. Any questions? Abha, any questions?
Yeah.
I hope I didn't go too fast.
No, sir. I think it was absolutely bang on, the topics which you were talking. So what I would also like to understand is, in the changing scenario, as you mentioned, there are new aspirations coming in from the refugees who are already in the country. How do the host the country itself, not the host country, but the origin country, responds to it? Are they willing to take them back, or what legal status do these people have if they want to go back to their own country?
See, so if you look at it, each country or each community faces a different issue in their home country. So, for example, let's look at Tibet. Now, the Tibetans who fled Tibet, China does not recognize Tibet. It looks at Tibet as an autonomous area of China, whereas the government in exile looks at Tibet as an independent nation. So the chances of resolving this can only happen when all parties, including China, including the Tibetans, India, or the global community, sits down and resolves it. So it does not seem to be resolving. So in the absence of resolving, there's a status quo. In the absence of a status quo, either you create a policy in the host country or everything works ad hoc. Similarly, if you look at Sri Lanka, now Sri Lankans, what would they do? There is still a certain amount of disquiet in terms of the Tamil, issue. There are Tamilians in Sri Lanka. Is the conditions conducive enough for these Sri Lankans to go back, not only in terms of life and limb, but also in terms of opportunities? And when a migrant feels that a host country is giving them more opportunities than the home country, why would the migrant go back?
Mm.
So, for example, if we look at a news item where they see that the GDP of Bangladesh is growing faster than the GDP of India, and there are more opportunities, they are going back.
Mm.
See, we have to look at the fact that human beings inevitably human beings like water will find a way to move. You cannot stop. So the aspirations. So how does the home and host country then look at? Somewhere down the line, the countries or the nations will need to figure out how they are working with this human capital. It's a capital. And more often than not in South Asia, the Indian subcontinent, the capital is phenomenal. And somewhere down the line, the nation states are not able to figure out how to work with this capital.
Mm. No, I was also just thinking that I'm sure there are a lot of Tibetans across the world,
Yes.
not only in India.
Yes.
So, how are they being? Are they the citizens of that country, or they are again refugees in all the other countries also?
So, for example, the West have a very clear policy of naturalization. So, over a period of time, if you stay in that particular country, for example, they have a refugee policy. So, if you come across as a refugee, they allow you to stay out there. Then, over a period of time, you can naturalize and become citizens.
Mm. Okay.
So we do not still have a regulatory framework. And again, in the absence of a regulatory framework, ad hocism happens, then political considerations come in.
Of course, of course.
And again, as I said, this is not an India-based phenomena, it's a world-based phenomena. Nation states, there are politics, there are right-wing politics, there are left-wing politics, center politics. We see what's happening in France today. France conflict, the boy, 17-year boy who was killed was an Algerian. Algeria had been a colony of France. There are identity politics. Then there is, the citizen versus people who have migrated. So, still Algerians or Black Africans who are in France, there is a certain amount of racism which is happening. Let's not look at it from good, bad, right, wrong. That is what is happening. So obviously these politics will happen, these identity conflicts will happen, nations will have to figure out how to, and the nations which are able to handle them well or create regulatory frameworks or something are able to, work out, are able to utilize this capital. After all, it's a capital.
Yeah, absolutely right, sir.
Although you have some question in the message box, chat box.
Okay, the chat box I had not. How much has climate change global? In fact, Sridharan, we are not. In fact, the world over, we are still not factoring in the climate change and the global warming. In fact, I was reading an article where they're talking about 5 nations in the next. The way Arctic is heating up and the way Antarctica ice is breaking up, Arctic ice is almost kind of moved. You see the kind of precipitation which is happening. And obviously, the world is in for some major shock because, once these climate change and global warming hits, Bangladesh is going to be definitely affected. India coastline is going to be affected, and once these countries are going to get affected, how much of if you see your mainstream media, how much of these kind of talks are happening? See, inevitably, unless scholars or academicians or intellectuals talk about this, there are points of views and there has to be major negotiation which needs to work out. What happens if tomorrow, this thing happens when the coastlines get eroded, people move further inwards. How does it happen? So Sridharan, it is happening. It is already happening. Migrations are happening. They are being papered over by other issues, but definitely this is an issue which needs to be talked about, which needs to be looked at. And this is going to be something which is going to be a major problem in the near future. To Tibetans and Sri Lankans are natural citizens. Indian government is giving some amount of naturalization to, for example, Afghans who have been out here have been given naturalization. I have not read about Sri Lanka. Sada, has Sri Lankans been given any
Sri Lankans, I'm not very sure, but even Tibetan, they don't like to be natural citizen because they're getting more privilege as a refugee.
So there are other considerations which come about.
Yes.
And I think also there might be possibility that because if Tibetans start getting citizenship of India, then the whole Tibetan cause might go.
Maybe.
So you also have to look at, again, as I said, identity, how the identity works, and the politics associated with identity also needs to be factored in. So as of now, only Afghani refugees have been, especially from 79, have been naturalized. Not all, because at some point, I think the refugees also, are looking at the fact that a lot of these refugees then look at India as a launch pad and then go to the West. So, for example, Tibetans, there are a lot of Tibetans who are now, you will see, on the West Coast in the US. That was Jaya's question. Does all refugees are considered immigration? Yes, because for a simple reason, we do not have we are neither a signatory nor do we have a refugee policy. So inevitably, every refugee is looked at from the Foreigners Act and then looked at as an illegal migrant, one who does not have a visa. Jaya?
Thank you, sir. I have one more question.
Okay. Jaya, just let me finish with Kangan's question.
Okay.
Southeast Asian countries have surplus population, by EU have negative population. So both group can, possibly, yes. But again, then they look at from the point, you're absolutely right. And in fact, when this refugee crisis in Britain, there was a lot of talk about when Britain decided to send its refugees to Rwanda. One of the larger, discussion which was happening is when Britain, created these many refugee problems, why should Britain take all these refugees in? Why should they, insulate themselves and say that refugees should be sent to Rwanda? Actually, Britain has a refugee policy. Why should these refugees settle in this place? So, Kangat, you're right, but this is again something which the world has to talk about. Nations have to talk about. And, the interesting part is, I think my feeling is with climate change and global warming and the increase of sea levels, the world would have to come and start talking to each other. And in the absence of world talking to each other, we would have those, what we call, we had a term in the 70s, 80s, the MAD term, mutual assured destruction. During the Cold War, we had this MAD term. Kangat? So, Veera, refugees inevitably, asylum seekers are refugees. So any person who's politically persecuted or, persecuted because of their culture, because of their religion, because of their identity are refugees. And when these refugees then typically seek asylum in a host country based on, for example, today, Julian Assange is seeking asylum in another country, or Snowden is seeking asylum, in spite of the fact he's an American. He's seeking asylum in Russia or any other country because he's being persecuted. Refugees are general people who are persecuted in a home country. When they go and they typically, asylum seeking is a legal term whereby they say, because we are being persecuted, give us an asylum out here and we would like to stay out here. Veera?
Okay, sir. That means they are asking legal rights or legal protection.
That's right. They are asking legal protection. Jaya, you wanted... Sorry, Veera, tell me.
Okay, sir. I have another question. Can I ask
Okay.
her after?
Let Jaya finish the question. Yes,
Okay.
Jaya.
Sir, we have internally displaced people, right?
Correct.
Even they are considered to be refugees, or the term refugee is only for those who cross the national borders?
Term refugees is typically for one who cross national borders, though refugees now is a term when you're taking refuge from outside your home. It's a refugee. English term refugee is when you're taking refuge.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Yes, Veera.
Hi, sir. As per this class, I have one question, sir. What are the possible reasons why India not able to create a proper migration policy like any Western countries? Is there
Veera, Veera, possibly, I guess the political considerations take over. Policy requires some amount of political will. See, for example, a lot of things require a lot of political will. And political will also requires a lot of discussions. And because there are divergent viewpoints, the leadership then has to look at how to reconcile. See, at the end of the day, politics is the art of impossible. So you're looking at divergent, viewpoints. At the same time, the leadership requires one to take a decision based on available information in the. So, for example, look at. Let me give you an alternate, example. We are looking at digital, as a technology. And we have been pushing digital as a technology, and obviously digital technology has a lot of benefits vis-a-vis the analog or the usual technology. However, digital technology has a lot of disadvantages, considering the fact that it impinges on the privacy. The Indian state is taking a lot of time to be able to come out with a digital privacy bill. Now they're talking again of a draft. See, somewhere down the line, and things are changing very fast. So maybe possibly you need some amount of political will, you need divergent viewpoints, you need to integrate those viewpoints, and democracy is a challenge that way. Veera?
Okay, sir. I am thinking, okay. I have another question, sir. In Tamil Nadu, as per today's class, Tamil Nadu government is giving proper facilities or rehabilitation to Sri Lankan refugees. Tibetans, that means India has given to little bit of facilities to Tibetan refugees. Who is the responsible person, state government or central government?
So for Tibetans, now the Indian government has formulated a policy in 2014. So once the government of India has formulated a policy, all state governments are supposed to follow suit.
Okay.
It's a common policy. Whereas for the rest of the refugees, it depends on too much of an ad hocism.
In this ad hocism approach, I think local or state political parties' influence is very high.
Correct. Absolutely. That would always happen because it affects the local politics. See, we need to understand the fact politics plays a very important part. And that's what, we were talking just before the start of the class. Politics is a very important part and we need to understand it. And again, as a scholar and an academician, one needs to also factor in the politics which come into play and understand it. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Wonderful. So we have already overshot the mark by 9 minutes, but however, wish you a very happy weekend. Dr. Sahu, you want to say something?
No, nothing much. Let's conclude now.
Okay. policy lags behind issue. For example, Kangat, that's because of the fact that, things change very fast unless you have specifically policy groups. So for example, the West, the institutions, the universities, the think tanks, they simultaneously work together, which somehow we are not able to steadily integrate with, the government and other, private and other, industries. And that's why there is a lag. And the lag today with in terms of, internet and the way information is traveling and the way information is moving and where the people are moving, then it becomes a hyperdrive and you're always falling back. So have a nice weekend and see you whenever we meet next.